Hello everyone. If you're new here in the PEX News channel, don't forget to hit that subscribe button for fact-based analysis and sharp coverage of today's biggest global stories. This week, global attention is locked on a single high-stakes meeting set to take place in Alaska between U.S. President Donald Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin. On paper, the talks are being framed as a possible step toward ending the war in Ukraine. In reality, experts warn they may be more about delay, optics, and strategic advantage than genuine peace. At the heart of the controversy is what analysts are calling a misleading land swap proposal coming out of Moscow. Russia, they say, is deliberately making demands it knows neither Ukraine nor European leaders can accept. This tactic, known in diplomatic circles as making maximalist claims, is often used to stretch out negotiations without ever arriving at a settlement. The longer the process drags on, the more time Russia has to press its military campaign on the ground, where it still believes it can achieve its objectives. What's at stake for Moscow is not just territory, but the threat of sweeping new U.S. sanctions. President Trump has warned that if Russia does not make serious concessions, his administration will impose secondary sanctions on Russian oil exports, a move that could cripple the Kremlin's war financing. Oil revenues are the backbone of Russia's military budget. Without them, sustaining the conflict becomes far more difficult. However, Friday's Alaska summit has already provided Moscow with breathing room. Trump's latest self-imposed deadline for these sanctions quietly passed without action, raising questions about whether the meeting itself is being used as an excuse to postpone economic pressure. European leaders are alarmed. They have been pressing Washington to strengthen sanctions before the summit, warning that any delay only benefits Russia. Many see this meeting as a decisive moment for Ukraine's future, one where the wrong concessions could lock in Russian territorial gains and weaken Kyiv's position permanently. But Washington's messaging has been mixed. Vice President J.D. Vance recently stated that both Russia and Ukraine are likely to be unhappy with any eventual deal, and bluntly added that the U.S. is done funding Ukraine's war effort. While Europe has agreed to take on a greater share of Ukraine's defense costs, the statement reflects a broader shift in American policy priorities under Trump's leadership. Putin's stated conditions are uncompromising. He is demanding Ukraine's full withdrawal from 4 regions Russia claims as part of its territory. Entering talks from such a position puts Kyiv at a severe disadvantage, especially when its participation in the meeting is not guaranteed. There have been suggestions that President Volodymyr Zelensky might be invited to join later in the process, but for now, the plan is for Trump and Putin to meet one-on-one. That exclusion speaks volumes about how the talks are being framed, not as a tripartite negotiation, but as a direct U.S.-Russia dialogue. The location adds another layer of symbolism. Alaska is the only U.S. state that physically borders Russia across the Bering Strait. It's a setting that underscores the bilateral nature of these talks while placing them geographically and politically far from Europe. In diplomatic terms, the message is clear. This is a Washington-Moscow conversation in which other stakeholders, including Ukraine and European allies, will have little say. As for the so-called land swap, the reality is far more dangerous than the phrase suggests. Ukraine no longer controls any significant Russian territory to trade away. Any swap would almost certainly involve Russia relinquishing small, less strategically important areas in exchange for large, critical parts of eastern Ukraine, particularly in the Donbas region. If Ukraine were forced to hand over the remainder of Donetsk province, for example, it would lose a key defensive line of fortified towns that have so far prevented Russian forces from advancing deeper into the country. Such a concession would leave central and western Ukraine far more exposed to future attacks. Beyond territory, the NATO question looms large. For years, Russia has insisted that Ukraine must never be allowed to join the alliance, and that European forces should not be stationed there. Some analysts believe President Trump could be willing to agree to such terms, effectively closing the door on Ukraine's NATO ambitions. If that happens, it would be a significant concession to Moscow's long-term strategic goals, one made without European representation in the room. Critics say this dynamic plays directly into Russia's broader strategy: keep Europe divided, keep Ukraine isolated, and keep the war going until battlefield realities make any negotiated settlement favorable to Moscow. By making demands that seem reasonable to Trump but unacceptable to almost everyone else, the Kremlin can stall U.S. sanctions, avoid diplomatic isolation, and continue its military operations with fewer economic consequences. For Ukraine, the risks are enormous. Being excluded from the early stages of talks means decisions about its future could be made without its direct input. Being invited in only at the end, if at all, would leave Kyiv with little opportunity to push back against terms already agreed between Washington and Moscow. Meanwhile, in Europe, the Alaska summit has sparked urgent discussions among political leaders. There's a growing recognition that, whatever Trump decides in his meeting with Putin, Europe must have its own unified plan for supporting Ukraine and deterring further Russian aggression. For now, the continent is bracing for what could be a pivotal and possibly unsettling moment in modern geopolitics. Whether the Alaska talks produce a breakthrough, a stalemate, or simply another delay, one fact is clear: the stakes could not be higher for Ukraine, for Europe, and for the global balance of power. So what's your take? Drop a comment below.